Hello, Ramesh.
Hi, John.
Welcome back to Blogging Heads.
Thanks. How are you doing?
Wonderful.
Great.
So for our first topic, I believe we're going to address the epistemic closure debate that has been raging through the blogosphere.
Yeah, I'm just so pleased that a phrase like epistemic closure has become such a source of controversy and discussion anywhere, really.
I know people are almost coming to blows over epistemic closure. Should I define epistemic closure?
Why not?
Okay, well, this phrase
Although Blogging Heads viewers are perfectly capable, they understand these things, I assume.
it's a sophisticated audience.
Right.
But epistemic closure is a phrase, I don't know if it was invented, but it was introduced into the present debate by Julian Sanchez, who's a kind of libertarian-ish blogger who's associated with Cato. And he argued that the right is moving toward epistemic closure, meaning a kind of world in which they control all information sources. Only information sources controlled by the conservative movement are considered to be reliable and trustworthy. And so you have, I think what he was saying, that it's mostly, but not entirely, a kind of a mass phenomenon, so that not necessarily among conservative elites, although somewhat among them, but certainly more so among people who are, your more rank-and-file conservatives, get information only from movement-controlled sources. And basically, anything that comes from the liberal media is just considered to be something that they shouldn't pay any attention to.
Right.
And he argued that you don't really have the equivalent phenomenon on the left, or certainly not on the mainstream liberal left. You might have it on tiny precincts of the far left. So what's your? I think his thesis is broadly persuasive. Obviously, you could poke some holes here and there, but I think it's broadly persuasive. So what's your take?
Well, I guess my general take is that the phenomenon, and this is just more sort of a sense, my sense of things rather than something that I could prove. My sense is that the phenomenon is real. It has been increasing over the last 10 to 20 years, and it is troubling. And it's a problem, particularly for the right. And I do have this sense that it is more of a problem for the right than it is for the left, with a caveat that I'll get to.
Yeah.
And I actually, it's not even so much the refusal to listen to points of view outside the conservative cocoon, although that is a problem, but also I've had an increasing sense over the years that conservatives don't care to talk to people outside that cocoon as well, that they're not interested in persuading non-conservatives to move to the right the way that they used to be. And of course, these are related things, since generally talking and listening go hand in hand.
Yeah.
I think that there has been much more emphasis among conservatives on mobilizing existing conservatives rather than minting new ones, and thus there's been less of an emphasis on persuasion. And that this is not to say that talking to one's fellow conservatives is a waste of time. I work at a magazine that fundamentally does exist to talk to a conservative audience primarily, although
right.
not exclusively.
Yeah.
I just think that the balance has gotten out of whack. The one thing that gives me pause, though, about the conclusion about the relative. Whether this is more of a problem on the right or the left is, it seems to me that if that is true, then you would expect there to be more false information circulating among conservatives than among liberals. And while there have been some surveys that have purported to show this,
yeah.
I've tended to find that those surveys pretty flawed. For example, there was the one a few years ago which suggested that conservatives were likely to think that there were much tighter links between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda than
right.
there actually were, which is an interesting datum, certainly, but it seems to me you need to test that against the kind of false claims that might be more accepted on the left, and then see, on which side were the false claims more accepted. And my general sense of this, not having done an in-depth study of it, is that in your sort of basic sort of information, what is the size of the deficit, what is the party that controls Congress, et cetera, the conservatives tend to actually have a stronger information base than liberals on average.
Well, I agree that it's problematic to prove this, although that just because it's hard to prove doesn't mean it's not true. The political scientist Brendan Nyhan did a somewhat related experiment, which was on the effect of busting up myths, and he I don't know if you're familiar with the experiment, but I'll sum it up for the audience, where he exposed audiences to myths that confirmed their views. So liberals, I think, were told that President Bush banned all stem cell research, which is not exactly true. He only banned federal funding of stem cell research, and conservatives got some kind of conservative myth that was, I think, that the Bush tax cuts had led to an increase in federal tax revenues. And then he that was the control group, and then the other group got that myth in a news story with a paragraph specifically pointing out that this was not correct. And he found that the liberals basically continued to believe it at the same rate, despite being corrected. And conservatives believed it at a higher rate when it was corrected. So the correction actually backfired, which I thought was interesting.
I did read about that Brendan Nyhan study, maybe on your blog, but I didn't follow the link because, I only read approved news sources, and I thought that would disturb my existing biases too much. That is interesting, too. There's a certain kind of cussedness and distrust of news outlets that I could very easily see having that effect. I mean, that is a very plausible story to me. But beyond sort of trying to, for people like me to try to go out of our way to correct various bits of misinformation as far as we can figure out what they are.
Which you do. I'll give you credit. You do that.
Well, thank you. I'm not sure what one does about it.
Right.
Gosh, I guess we're not really clashing much.
Well, let me just make an observation. I don't know if you'll agree with this or not, but I think a lot of this stems from the nature of the conservative critique of the liberal media, or the mainstream media, as I would call it, liberal media as you'd call it. Which is that I think it basically just goes way too far. I think there are elements of truth in the conservative critique, and the liberals have a critique of the media, which also I think has elements of truth. But the conservative critique of the media is just much more sweeping. It's much stronger. It basically views the mainstream media outlets as being essentially propaganda organs for liberalism in the Democratic Party, which I think is just very far removed from reality, and basically regards those.
You mean as in the sense of being sort of conscious and explicit?
Yes.
That, like the editors of the New York Times wake up every morning thinking, how do I advance the agenda of the Democratic Party today?
Right, exactly. Right, and I think there was a story several years ago on National Review about the Associated Press called "Associated with Whom," and the implication was that they were associated with liberalism in the Democratic Party in some big way. Which I thought that was. Personally, I found that comical because the AP is as straight as you can come, which doesn't mean they're perfect. But so the liberal critique is just much less sweeping of the mainstream media, and I guess I suppose this is all based on my factual premise that the mainstream media, despite flaws, is pretty good at informing people about what's going on in the world and trying to present both sides of what both parties are saying. So. This has just caused the right to just completely shut out, number one, to completely shut out the mainstream media in many cases, and number two, to create an alternative media universe that's sort of the mirror reflection of their imagining of what the mainstream media is, which is just, pure propaganda organs. And I think you find a surprising number of people who really do shut it out. I mentioned this in my blog several years ago. I saw a profile of Clarence Thomas, who said that the only sources of news he listens to at all are Rush Limbaugh and the American Spectator, and I found that kind of frightening.
Yeah, sometimes people say these sorts of things for effect. I mean, the one I've met Justice Thomas once or twice. The first time I met him, he mentioned having seen me on C-SPAN on Washington Journal. So obviously he consumes some other forms of media as well.
That's good.
Yeah, I think Bruce Bartlett's written about this recently, and one does run into conservatives, although I think it's a pretty rarefied bunch who will, make a point of pride. I don't read the Washington Post or the New York Times. Like, well, congratulations on being totally uninformed.
Right.
Although actually, I suppose it is now more possible to be informed via the web. But even if you're going to conservative media outlets, to the extent that you're getting information from them, in a lot of cases it's because they're linking to the Washington Post and the New York Times. All of us in sort of the opinionated world of journalism are certainly benefiting a great deal from the mainstream media, which, in my view, there is a pervasive and often unexamined liberalism, especially on social issues. But certainly nothing like a kind of conscious and sort of explicit propagandizing.
Yeah, and part of the problem with the way the internet has changed the way people consume news is that it allows you to, when you do consume media outside of your little world, it's usually filtered by someone who agrees with you, right? So I think this happens on the left too, but a conservative, if they link to something in mainstream media, it'll either be to say, here's another example of the biased left-wing media and why we can't trust them. Look at what they're saying. Or to, see, even the left-wing media agrees with us that blah, blah, blah. So it can be filtered into that little bubble.
Yeah, one thing that I find very tiresome reading on either the left or the right, this constant assumption of political partisans that their side is just too weak, too nice, and the other side is just ruthless and disciplined, and and you see this constantly from people who are, I think, for the most part, unaware that their sort of antimatter versions are saying the exact same thing. Right. Yeah. No, yeah. The lack of awareness that's exactly the pinpointed issue. Now, I do think that you've had a somewhat of an asymmetrical ideological mobilization within the two parties. I think it's really caught up pretty well, actually very quickly over the last congressional session. But you basically have the Republican Party has pretty much become the arm of the conservative movement, and it disagrees on things, but it's essentially a conservative party, and I don't think the Democratic Party is the arm of a liberal or progressive movement to the same extent. Although I will say that over the past year, they've caught up very, very quickly. I think at the beginning of 2009, I think you had the Republican Party much more coherent, much more bound up in a kind of joint partisan aim, and Democrats in Congress were still acting more like people in Congress acted traditionally over the post-war era, which was a very bipartisan era, the sort of assuming of we're going to assert our own individual prerogatives as Congress and stand up for our parochial interests and assert our own individual power bases. But I think again they decided that was a losing strategy over the course of the year and became much more partisan. The larger number of voters who consider themselves conservative rather than liberal is, in a way, a weakness for the right, because it makes it much more tempting for conservatives to think that they can kind of go it alone.
Right.
Whereas I think, if we can debate about quite how meaningful those percentages are, but I think they mean something. Mm-hmm. And I think that if you are a liberal who's seriously involved in politics, you have much more of a sense of the need to cater to people who don't agree with you.
I think that's probably right. I mean, I think you basically have a conservative party and a non-conservative party in American politics, and the non-conservative party is kind of a coalition of very, very moderate conservatives to liberals. So I think there's just inherently going to be a little bit more, ideological coherence, because it's possible you couldn't have a liberal party. It wouldn't be competitive in American elections, and you can have a competitive conservative party.
Right. I mean, and not only that. I mean, liberals just can't be as dominant within a party as conservatives can be within a party.
Right. But another parallel that you always see is, I think, people, sort of the liberals on the Democratic side and the very conservative people within the Republican Party, not understanding why the moderates within their party have more influence to shape things. They basically don't understand the way the political science works, that
right.
This is the marginal vote and this person could just as easily bolt to the other side and you have nowhere else to go. So obviously the liberals get very upset that why are we kowtowing to Ben Nelson? Well, because Ben Nelson, is really willing to kill this bill. And,
right.
And on the Republican side, you see the same. They just get furious at the moderates with their own side and why they get to have this disproportionate influence. It just seems like a lack of understanding of the kind of some basic political science concepts.
Yeah, well, on the conservative side, there is this. I suppose this isn't exactly misinformation, but it is a screwy interpretation of recent political history, in which not only is everything that went wrong for conservatism in the Bush years is not just a result of failing to stick to principle, which is in itself, I think, a misunderstanding of that history, but it's all sort of the fault of the rhinos. It's all the fault of the Arlen Specters of the world. And believe me, I have very little time for Senator Specter, and I'd be delighted if either a Democrat or a Republican beats him this year. But it's just not true that he is that he drove really much of anything during the Bush years.
Well, I also think just the broad critique that Bush was, an ideological squish. That's something I think is about 90% hokum and 10% truth. I think to the degree that he moved to the center, it was out of absolute political necessity. The biggest single, I know you've written about this, the biggest single instance is the prescription drug benefit, which was something that 90% of the public thought needed to be added, when he was running for election. And he had to be for it or he would have lost. There's no way you could say he would have come even close enough to, win Florida by faulty ballots if he was against that in 2000.
Right, and I would also add that he would not have won re-election. He wouldn't have won Ohio if he hadn't delivered on that promise with the Republican Congress. It would have been extremely difficult to explain. It would have been a great line for Senator Kerry in the debates. And
the only way he was able to basically get tax cuts through was you had opinion polls basically showing the tax cuts were pretty much the lowest public priority. So he just had to say, no, we can do it all. We can get that Medicare benefit. We can have the defense spending. We can pay down all the national debt, and we can pay taxes. And that was the way he explicitly made the argument. So Democrats were trying to say, no, we don't have enough money for all these things. We have to choose. And Bush was saying, no, we don't have to choose. And so if he basically conceded that we have to choose, well, then his priorities would have lost, and it would have put him at a major disadvantage.
Well, in public opposition to tax cuts, those polls did show that people preferred deficit reduction, and they preferred various other priorities to tax cuts.
Right.
But the public opposition to tax cuts was pretty diffuse. There weren't many people who were going to, sort of vote against somebody because they voted for tax.
No, that's not what I'm saying. No, I'm just saying that they were happy to get a tax cut. But number one, if taxes were going to be cut, they wanted them to be cut. If you ask people, first of all, how should you cut taxes, they thought it would be more like X dollars per head rather than in proportion to your tax burden or your income tax burden, as Bush would put it, or even more regressive as he actually did deliver it. But more importantly, they said, okay, if you want a tax cut, but which do you want the most? And tax cuts always rank below those other priorities, which is why, Bush's big speech in 2001, he led with everything else. He said, we're going to pay down the debt, we're going to do prescription drugs, we're going to, invest in defense and everything else. And now we've taken it all, we've got so much more money, we don't even know what to do with it. Then we're going to cut taxes because we've got nothing else to do with it, basically.
On the tax point, this is something that I've been writing about recently, and again, I'm not sure this is epistemic closure in the sense of false information, but it is, I think there is a real echo chamber effect. Yeah. I really noticed around this tax day, for the last 10 years, there's been this building chorus on the right that says it's a huge problem that all these people, 47% according to some estimates, pay no income tax, have no net income tax liability. But really, this time, I'd never seen it as sort of uniform. This is just this talking point that not only conservative writers and conservative politicians, but just your typical conservative voter.
You're right. It really
they're all
filtered down.
saying this now, and it just strikes me as just there's such a set of foolish interlocking assumptions, as. Well, you're familiar with this argument, that the idea that all these folks who don't pay income taxes are going to be pro-big government, and it's a huge problem.
Right, which they're clearly not.
The basic empirical point is how many people really make this sort of hard and fast distinction between payroll taxes and income taxes.
Or even state taxes and national taxes.
Right, yeah. No, when people think they're... this is actually... the funny thing is these things have always been actually central to conservative political success.
Yeah.
The idea that, when you get mad about taxes, most voters aren't going to distinguish between, their local board of assessors and Congress. They're just mad about taxes. Yeah,
I remember, what was it? I remember being in college somewhere. This was, after Bush made the budget deal in 1990 and, took all the heat for breaking his no new taxes pledge. And, I was paying, I'd pay something and then the cashier says I have sales tax. And he says, oh, yes, the Bush tax.
Yeah, right.
No, Bush did not levy the state sales tax here.
Well, that same year, Christie Whitman almost beat Bill Bradley for the Senate because people were upset about the Governor Florio's tax increase in New Jersey, which, Bradley really had nothing to do with.
Right. So, I think you're right. I think you're definitely onto something, that this idea has become much more prevalent, and it used to be an idea that circulated among conservative intellectuals in magazines, in op-eds, and now you're right, it's everywhere. And I have two things to say about it. Number one, I wrote last year a piece about Ayn Rand and the influence of Randian thought, and I feel like that's part of that influence making itself felt, right? The idea that society is divided between the moochers and the looters on the one hand, and the people who actually produce on the other hand. And this statistic is sort of is taken as evidence of that. And number two, just kind of ironically, for years you had conservatives trying to rally public opposition to income taxes by saying that it used to be a class tax, which is actually how it was originally created, something that only very rich people pay, and then it became a mass tax, and this is why people should vote for Republicans, and this is why people should oppose it, because the Democrats they'll start off by saying they're on the rich, but they're really going to sneakily impose it on you. And now they're actually making it more of a class tax again. But you can see that's really much more upsetting to conservatives than it becoming a mass tax.
Well, it's sort of it induces dizziness, because from Reagan onward, the orthodoxy among conservatives was we want to cut sort of middle income people's taxes, and now when I argue for middle class tax reforms, I sometimes feel like I'm going uphill, and that the orthodoxy now is no, these people pay too few taxes, and we need to raise their taxes, which is, of course, in addition to whatever substantive problems they may have, just a suicidal political strategy.
I agree that it's suicidal political strategy, though I do think, if you started from the premise that we need a sensible fiscal policy, which I think there are very few people on the right who would share that premise as I define it. In other words, if you basically think we need to have a tax burden that raises enough taxes to pay for the government we actually do have, rather than the government you wish we had, then you're probably going to have to raise taxes on the middle class. But that's basically at that step. I think you're going to lose most of the people on the right, or at least we're going to quickly break down a disagreement before we even get to that level of the debate.
Yeah, that's probably, you'd have a very familiar argument with most conservatives saying we should just have spending cuts. But let me put it this way: I believe it is possible to have a tax code that is more pro-growth, simpler, more efficient, better in a lot of respects, but in which the tax burden is paid a little bit less by the middle class, a little bit more by affluent voters. Yep. And I now think that a lot of conservatives would just sort of reflexively be against that kind of idea.
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
because they regard I'm not particularly in favor of progressivity in the tax code, but I don't think it is the fundamental, one of the chief problems of the tax code.
I think that's right. I mean, I think at the wonk level, there should be some room for agreement where conservatives are willing to make some concessions to progressivity in return for getting a lot of reforms that are beneficial, basically, for everyone. I mean, liberals aren't in favor of high tax rates per se. Liberals are in favor of high tax rates as a means to the end of achieving progressivity in the tax code. But I think most liberal wonks understand that there are better and more efficient ways to achieve progressivity other than high tax rates.
Well, we'll have to start a working group and build this consensus.
Is there anything we should fight over before we go to maintain your conservative street cred, so you're not, drummed out?
Oh, I'm doing okay. Every once in a while somebody tries to drum me out, but usually the people trying to drum me out are people nobody's ever heard of. So,
should I call you a racist?
Okay, yeah, that'll help.
You're such a racist.
Well,
basically, I wasn't saying it, but pretty much everything you were saying in this debate was racist.
Well, yeah, I'm working on it.
So,
always good talking to you.
You too, Ramesh.
Take care.
Okay, bye.